to do it in Nigeria. Where do you want to do? One of them was held on a Sunday. He said, that's the only time I'm free. Come to my house. And if he comes and he offers you refreshments, you take the refreshments and then you sit down, you know your questions. You don't have a sheet of paper reading out questions, but you get them to talk, sort of pretend you're sympathetic to their position, and then you get them to talk. So that's an example of how you do things, but you've got to be aware of the cultural things. They're little things, but they help in your success. Yeah, and it's sort of always bear in mind, I'll say to myself, pick my battles. You've got to pick your battles. What is the core thing? What do you want to achieve? That is the only battle you fight. The other thing, if somebody decides to keep me waiting for an hour, I can let that go. That's not an important battle. Do you see what I mean? So you think, what is the core battle? And fight only that. But you could waste energy fighting other little battles, and you lose the core one.
Well, I think that's one of the most, it's a great question. I think one of the most difficult. Well, I think we face it in any environment, but when you go into a different environment where things are less clear to you, something new, then making those judgments about where the line is between, this is just different, and the way they do things here this isn't acceptable, is very tricky. So yeah, great question. Anyone else got a question? Or even any other questions? Yeah, there's one in the corner.
I was just going to say, just as a realist, looking back, say 20 years from now, do you think that we're going to be looking at Africa with seriously, substantially better institutions and less corruption because of that? And if so, what realistically can PwC contribute to that?
Yeah. So if you didn't catch that on this side, I guess where we'll be in 20 years' time, will there be stronger institutions, Dom, and will PwC play the part in it? As a realist, well, I suppose I'm a realist and an optimist, and I often find that's not a conflict. I think, talked to my dad about it this week actually, and also to a client last week saying the same, and there was a huge amount of optimism about the future of Africa in the late 50s and early 60s, either side of independence, and many people who were around in that era are comparing that feeling then with now, and a certain confidence and self-belief re-emerging that perhaps hasn't been there through a whole period of 50 or so difficult years for most of the continent. So if you were standing here in 1960, you'd be saying as a realist and an optimist, yes, it's going to be fantastic, and yes, the institutions will be stronger in the private and the public sector, and if you were talking about PwC, you'd probably say, yes, we'd have played a part in it, and you'd have been horribly wrong. So, fingers crossed. I think this time it will be different. I think a lot of lessons have been learned, and I think that leadership is actually the biggest single factor. And Africa has been dogged by bad leadership for too long. And if we are really honest about it, some of that has been the fault of Africans, and most of it has probably been the fault of other powers. So you go through the Cold War period where basically dictators were left in power because they supported either the Soviet Union or the US. That has damaged countries enormously. And if you add that to the experience of the previous 300 or 400 years, then you can see why many African countries don't have the confidence and the capacity to go and change things easily. But I think a new generation, essentially the grandchildren of those who brought independence to the countries, is sort of standing up. You see that talking to business people in Nigeria, and I think it will be business people often rather than government that makes a difference in that leadership. And because of our links to both government and business, I'm confident we can make a difference. Now, we are not going to change the world. One of the good things about these markets is they are small at the moment but expanding. So I hope that not only do we make a difference, but also KPMG, Ernst & Young, Deloitte, I think is the other one, and other forms of consultants like McKinsey and so on. There is room for everyone to succeed and all get bigger here and all make a positive difference. But it's got to be done in the right way, and what we believe is that Africans must lead the change in Africa, and Africans must lead PwC in Africa, because otherwise we'll get it wrong again. Another great question. Yeah.
Do you find that there's a different range of competition in terms of business in the different African nations, in different African countries?
Yeah, different competition in different countries, that's for sure. So within the Big Four, you would find differences. So, for example, it's true to say that we're the biggest across the continent. Tom said at the beginning, but that's partly because in any Big Four business, and as it's no different, South Africa is probably going to be 80% of the total of Africa. Therefore, if you're the biggest in South Africa, you're going to be the biggest in the whole of Africa. Go to Nigeria, and we're probably 2/3 the size of KPMG in terms of numbers of partners. So you can get those sorts of changes. In certain markets, I think it's the brand that's different. So as I mentioned earlier, we are perceived much more narrowly as a brand in many countries. Kenya would be a very good example, where people who I know who have left the firm, got to work in banking, investments and so on, who I've talked to as part of my sort of due diligence on understanding not only the markets but also what we're doing in the firm, would say about the firm that it's very, very highly respected, the first person you turn to for audit and tax advice, but not known for those wider services. So in Kenya, KPMG have cleaned up on international development advisory work, for example, around the region. And we need to change that from a competitive basis, and it's through the alliance that we have a greater chance of actually implanting a team on the ground in one go that can start to stand its ground against KPMG in that market. So yeah, quite a lot of variation, not only in our capability, but in the perception of our capability. Yeah.
So we'll follow on from Jess's question just now. How much unity is there in Africa? So you talk about Africa a lot as a single entity, but there's, I think it's 30 different countries. So how does that work in practice?
So how much unity is there in Africa? Is the question. And yeah.
PwC.
Yeah, I was going to say, is it PwC, you mean PwC or you mean the whole of the continent itself?
A bit of both.
Yeah. Well, incredibly diverse continent. So yes, Africa is a shorthand, if you like, and there are lots of commonalities, but yes, huge differences. I think culturally, even within West Africa, you see a variety of different cultures. So that's for sure. And often people from outside underestimate those differences. Within PwC, yeah, I mean, one of my points again about integration is one of the key factors. We PwC globally brought PwC Africa into existence about just over 2 years ago, and that's brought a lot of the African countries into one grouping. The Francophone countries are in another grouping. Egypt and it goes to North Africa, Egypt and Libya in the Middle East. And then there are a variety of unassigned territories where we have no presence, the biggest of which is Ethiopia, which is the biggest gap in our CV. So we are some way off having a kind of fully joined up operation around the continent. Within PwC Africa, we now have unified leadership, so the lines of service run their businesses and the competencies below that across PwC Africa, so the English and Portuguese speaking countries. So if you are in consulting, then Jacques Lowe, who's the advisory leader, looks at advisory across all the countries. John Kaywood, who reports to the head of consulting, then does that for consulting. And it's a matrix essentially of reporting lines, but the first reporting line is through the Africa-wide competency or business unit line service. So we are on a journey towards greater integration, and that's something that, again, you come back to the word trust. We all have to trust each other as part of this journey of integration. So, when the UK firm turns up in overseas territories, often there is suspicion. Often that is understandable and may well be right as well. So people worry about their own, other people from the PwC world eating their lunch, and that's understandable. You only get through that phase by working together, building trust, and that's what we're really about. Including working with PwC France, I might add, which historically has not been the easiest relationship. But that's going back to what I said about Africa having 300 or 400 difficult years. That's a relationship with 1,000 difficult years, and it still crops up. Yeah.
You mentioned that in order to be successful with what we're doing in Africa, we need to have some kind of focus. I was wondering, what are going to be the key sectors
I think I mentioned some on the screen earlier in relation to government, financial services, oil and gas, and capital projects and infrastructure as the ones that we chose when we first looked at this together. I think one of the things that's happening so quickly in terms of identifying the key sectors is that things are changing so fast in certain places that actually the strategy that you would have developed 2 years ago would look wrong now. So even in the time that we produced these slides, and that those 4 areas were chosen probably back in February the first time, and that slide was part of the pack that went to partners for approval in the summer. From what we've seen, I mean, you can add cheek, I would say that telecoms is a massively important sector without a doubt because of its potential to link into financial services, digital, the way that people interact with their customers, the way the governments interact with their citizens, completely enables the transformation from that top-down dictatorial approach to something much more bottom-up. So I think telecoms and technology is fascinating. And the other one that's come out of, I wasn't going to say nowhere, but really emphasis being much greater is agribusiness, where every government that I've talked to in Africa is looking to exploit its agricultural potential. Massive potential, very low yields, lots of cultivatable land that's not being used at the moment. Brazil went through a massive agricultural revolution 30 years ago, has driven its development. And what the President of Ghana said to us very clearly last week when we talked to him was, they want to process the primary produce much more than they currently can and go into a much more value addition economy rather than just exporting primary products and be at the mercy of commodity prices. So agriculture, massive potential for feeding this 9 billion people, not just in Africa but beyond, and adding value through that. But that's a couple of industries. Yep.
We have a question from WebEx.
Yeah.
From Natalia Associates. They're asking, how does PwC plan to manage political instability in the country in order to avoid possible threats to its activities?
Yeah, good question. So how do we manage the political instability? Well, you can't manage political instability, I suppose, is the answer. In the short term, any more than you can manage the issues around health, and Ebola's brought that into a very sharp relief. So you just have to be able to react quickly to it and adapt strategy. I think to some degree, because Africa, to go back to an earlier question, is not a single country, you have a natural portfolio effect whereby you might expect in 2014 for the biggest growing countries to be these 5 next year, and you might be wrong, but you might be okay because some other countries are growing instead. I mean, you can prepare for stuff, and we know that Nigeria is a very important market, and we know that there's an election coming next year, and in the same way as we know there's an election coming next year here, our government practice will have a bit of a slowdown as a result. There may be fallout from those elections. Chika will know better than me.
Yeah, I mean, I think we have a team, we have a security team as well that monitors what's going on. You can't manage it, but you can manage your response and how quickly you respond to things. So we have a security team that constantly monitor situations around the world when they think it's going to escalate, and because they also manage insurance for PwC people as well. So they do that, and if they think that something is serious, then they would raise an alert. But things like the Nigerian election, there were Kenyan elections the other time, and people were really preparing for, any sort of violence and stuff like that. So the security team will have sort of, what you call it, business resilience practice that they will have in place just in case the election, the violence escalates and comes near to PwC offices. So they do these things behind the scenes. But they will only know if they think it's really, they raise it from amber to red. And then they will let everybody, give you a number to call if anything happens, where to go if you're involved by violence. So that's the best I know that we do, manage the situation where you think is going to escalate. They did that for Libya as well. When the whole Libya thing escalated, I was selling forensics, and we had a team out working in Libya. And, at the point, they had to bring all of them home, no matter how much you're earning from that revenue. The alerts, I think that was just before the Benghazi
Yeah.
thing, and they got the whole team back. But you only come to know of them when things like this happen.
Yeah, and we opened new offices in Liberia and Sierra Leone a year ago. So,
Yeah.
that's been obviously decimated in comparison to what the business plan was. So it's a good example of how things can happen that aren't planned. I would say the elevator pitch answer to the question of how you deal with political instability in Africa is that you have to take a long-term view. I think we've done it in the Middle East, as I said. If you recognise you're going to get instability and volatility, but you prepare to see it out, if you've made the right decision, made the right calls, then you'll get there in the end. And I think there will be bumps on the road in Nigeria, for example, to take the biggest economy in the continent. But as the head of the Department for International Development said when he was here recently, there will always be a reason in any given year to not invest in Nigeria. If you keep not investing, you'll face another risk, and that risk is missing the boat. So you have to find a balance. If you back your judgment and stick with it through the long term, then we'll be all right. And that's what I think we plan to do.
Thank you very much for the teaching.
Thanks, James.